What exactly is the Composition API? Well, let's start with what we learned thus far. When it comes to building Vue apps and Vue components, we thus far used the so-called Options API. We created this configuration object, and in there we configured various options. For example, the data option, the methods option, but maybe also computed or watchers. So we had this configuration object where we set up our data, our methods, so the code we could run upon events, for example, and so on. And I will emphasize it again. This approach is absolutely fine and you can stick to it. It's not bad, it's not a second best option. It is absolutely fine. And knowing it is actually a requirement for understanding the Composition API, I would say. But what is the Composition API then? This is the Options API. The Composition API is an alternative way of writing the logic behind our components. And it was introduced because we might, and I'm saying might, face two main limitations or issues when building bigger Vue apps. In smaller and medium-sized apps, we will very likely never face those issues, but in bigger apps, we might face them. Issue number one is that code that belongs together logically is actually split up across multiple options. Data, methods, computed, for example. And I have a little example project here. You don't find it attached here because we're not going to work with it here. I just want to show it to you. Now in this demo app, which brings this to the screen where we can sort various users, filter for users, and view the projects of our users, and also filter those projects. In this app, I'm using a couple of different components which together form this user interface. And this app is built with the features we learned over the last modules in this course. In all those components, I'm managing data, I might be getting some props, I might be registering more local components, we get some computed properties, some methods, some watchers. And that's not just the case in this one component, but in multiple components. Now, coming back to that first problem I brought up here, that code that might belong together logically is split up across data, methods, and computed, so across these different options. That's something we can see in this demo application. In the user list component here, for example, I have some data that is related to searching and other data that is related to sorting. I got a computed property that deals with searching and then one that deals with sorting. I got a method that deals with searching, one that deals with sorting. Got a watcher that deals with searching, and so on. And that's what I meant with features that belong together are split across these different options. Now, this is definitely not a horrible problem, and this is definitely not a super huge application, but it is an application where this component already could become a bit annoying to manage, because if you change something about searching, you might have to change it here in data, then change something here in the computed property, change something here in methods, and you have to scroll around a lot and find the different pieces that together make up the search feature, because the different pieces that make up that feature are split across various options. But that's not just the only issue we could be facing with the current way of building Vue apps. In addition to the problem I just described, reusing logic across components can also be tricky or cumbersome. Now, I will say there are ways of reusing logic, but they all have their downsides and might not be ideal. And in this demo app, there is logic that could be reused. Both in the user list as well in the projects list component, I have my search functionality. And I have similar computed properties and similar watchers. And it would be nice if we could reuse some logic here so that we don't have to write almost the same code twice in two different components. Well, and these are the problems we could be facing in bigger Vue applications with the current approach. Not technical problems, and maybe not problems at all to you. Maybe you're absolutely fine with that, but maybe things you would like to get rid of. And that's exactly where the composition API can help us. Instead of writing code like this, where we split our logic across multiple options, that's also why this API is called the Options API, we instead bundle our logic in a new setup method, which we add to our component config object. The setup method is added next to data and methods and so on, but it will actually replace data, methods, and so on. And we will manage our data, our functions, our computed properties, and our watchers in that setup method, where we then also expose them to the template so that we can interact with those things. And that's, by the way, important. The template code we write, features like vif and data binding, and all of that stays exactly the way you learned it. It's just how we set up our code in this object, in this component config object. That is what will change a bit when you switch to the composition API. Because we're going to merge, you could say, these four main options, data, methods, computed, and watch, into this setup method. But with that, we got enough theory. Let's now dig into the code and see how we actually get started with the composition API.